Afro-Brazilians are Brazilians who has African ancestry. Despite a large percentage of the population just declare themselves as Brazilian, you can still see the appearance, such as the noticeable African features and skin color. They're generally referred to as negro or preto, black. Then of course, you have the multicultural Brazilians who are called pardos, who also has African ancestry. How did this begin? The transatlantic slave trade involved the transportation of African people by slave traders, both by the indigenous on the continent and invaders. They were free Africans who became enslaved. This Holocaust of African people existed from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Many came from Central and Western Africa. The Portuguese in the 16th century were the first to engage in the Atlantic slave trade. They completed the first transatlantic slave voyage to Brazil. You ask why? The Native American population here in the Americas dwindled to the slave labor enforced by the Portuguese. Along with European diseases, it was stated by historians that the estimates of about 30,000 Amerindians under Portuguese rulership died of smallpox in the late 1500s. So Brazil became a large destination for African slaves in the Americas. An estimate of 4.9 million Africans were imported to Brazil. These Africans primarily originated from Upper Guinea, the Congo, and Angola. Because of the enforced labor and mistreatment, this caused many revolts. It all began in a place called Quilombo, a settlement founded by people of African origin. The inhabitants were escaped slaves, which wasn't used until the 1670s in the southern part of Brazil. In 1807, slaves were planning a revolt on May 28th. During Corpus Christi celebrations, the goal of the uprising was to capture slave ships and make a way back to Africa. Unfortunately, the slave master grew suspicious, sent in spies, and dismantled the plan. Many weapons were confiscated. In 1814, on February the 28th, slave fishermen began burning down parts of the harbor, killing the foreman and most of his family. As the rebels headed to another village, they were met with resistance by troops from Salvador. 4 of the captured slaves were hung in public, and 12 were deported to Portuguese colonies in Africa. In 1835, a Muslim slave revolt began. January the 24th, Muslim Africans fought in the streets of Salvador for 3 hours. 75 people were killed and more than 500 were sentenced to death, in prison, whipped, or deported, just to name a few. Now, on to some of the heroes and heroines of Afro-Brazilian revolts. Ganga Zumba was the first leader of a massive runaway slave settlement of Quilombo das Palmeiras, or Angola Younger. He too was a slave that escaped bondage on a sugar plantation and later became the highest authority within the kingdom of Palmeiras. Then created the title Ganga Zumba, meaning Great Lord in Kigongo. His primary role was a priest for spiritual defense of the community. The Brazilian film Ganga Zumba was made in 1963, but was not released until 1972 because there was a military coup in Brazil in 1964, and films about revolution was considered dangerous. Aquatune was an African princess who was the daughter of an unidentified Congo king. She was the mother of Ganga Zumba and the maternal grandmother of Zumba. In 1665, she led a force of 10,000 men in the Battle of Imwali, where she was captured and defeated. Zumba, or Zumbi dos Palmeiras, was a Brazilian of Congo, Angola. He was a pioneer of resistance to slavery of Africans by the Portuguese in Brazil. He was also the last of the kings of the Quilombo das Palmeiras, Today, he's revered in Afro-Brazilian culture as a powerful symbol of resistance against the enslavement of Africans in the colony of Brazil. He was married to another great warrior, Dundera. Dundera was an Afro-Brazilian warrior of the colonial period of Brazil, part of the Quilombo das Palmeiras. She was the wife of Zumbi, who had 3 children, and she dominated the techniques of capoeira, an Afro-Brazilian martial art that combines dance, acrobats, and music, developed by enslaved Africans in Brazil. After being arrested in February 6, 1694, she committed suicide, refusing to return to slavery. Teresa de Benguela was a Quilombo leader, married to Jose Bianjo, who headed the Quilombo del Bihejo. After his death, Teresa became the queen of the Quilombo, and under her leadership, both the black and indigenous community resisted slavery for 2 decades, surviving until 1770. The Quilombo was later destroyed by military forces, and the entire population of 79 blacks and 30 indigenous people was killed and arrested. Maria Filipa de Oliveira was one of the 3 women who participated in the struggle for Bahia independence in 1823. She led a group of 200 people, including black women and the indigenous, in a battle against the Portuguese, who attacked the Itaparica Island in 1822, her birthplace. Luisa Maim, a former slave of African origin based in Brazil. She was a member of the Mahi people of the Benin tribe. She was involved in the articulation of all the revolts and uprisings of slaves that shook the province of Bahia in 19th century. She was later persecuted, managing the escape to Rio de Janeiro, where she was found, detained, and deported to Angola. Her son, the poet and abolitionist Luis Gama, described her as a short, lean, beautiful woman, generous, and teeth white as snow. Luis Gama, a Brazilian romantic poet, journalist, lawyer, and prominent abolitionist. Gama not only wanted to abolish slavery, but also wanted Afro-Brazilians to actively participate in the abolitionist movement, as well as the democratization of Brazil. As a lawyer, Gama defended blacks in court who were illegally enslaved, especially those who were enslaved after slavery was abolished in 1831, and fought for their rights. He freed 500 slaves through the courts and also purchased the freedom of individual slaves. So, just to reiterate, before the abolition, the growth of the black population in Brazil was due to the need of slave labor that the indigenous population couldn't handle. The black population had a negative growth rate due to the life expectancy of the slave was 7 years. The demand of more African slaves were needed on the plantation to maintain the sugar production and mining for natural resources. Also, remember, the black woman was held by the whites and mixed race men as an official wife or as a concubine, or subjected to a condition of sexual slavery. The black woman was responsible for the growth of the Pardo population, which is a mixture of European, West African, native Brazilian, or South Asian. And let's not forget, many of your Portuguese and Spaniards transporting and enslaving the Africans into Brazil were Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula.